Here's Rachel. Oh, that is gorgeous.
Hello.
That's good.
Rachel O'Reilly was last seen yesterday morning after she dropped her 2-year-old son Adam off at this creche.
Rach, this is Joe. I'm now really, really worried about you. Please call me. Please call. It isn't funny. This isn't like you.
Rachel O'Reilly was found dead by her mother yesterday afternoon.
The minute I looked at her, I knew she was dead.
There was an awful lot of blood. She had severe injuries, splits in her scalp.
Boy killer. You know, somebody somewhere has to have seen something.
She says, myself and Rachel had a rocky relationship. It was rocky at times.
There were more salacious headlines being used, casting doubt on his story.
They said, Joe, did you ever have an affair? Did you have an affair?
It was so shocking. I found myself looking up from taking my notes. Am I really hearing this?
Any crime reporter in Dublin is demanding to know what the latest is on the Rachel O'Reilly case.
The viciousness and savagery of that crime is absolutely astounding.
I said to Jim, I think Joe murdered our Rachel.
I think the majority of people don't want to believe that a husband is going to do something like that.
A man arrested yesterday and questioned at Drogheda Garda station walked free last night.
I definitely remember being utterly convinced that we'd spoken to a murderer on the show that day.
The Breakfast Show with Eamon Dunphy on News Talk 106.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. It's 7:35.
In 2004, Ireland had become known as the Celtic Tiger. Its economy was growing, its people richer, and Dublin was at the core of this extraordinary boom.
A study into social and economic change in Ireland found 750,000 more people are working.
Joe and Rachel O'Reilly lived 19 miles from the city centre with their 2 young sons in the Knoll, North County Dublin.
It's a small, rural, spread-out community, just a couple of local schools servicing the place. It's a safe place to bring up your children because it's a lovely area. It's a really picturesque setting.
Joe had left for work at 5:30 that morning, leaving Rachel to take the boys to school and creche, as she usually did. At 12:30 p.m, Rachel would normally pick up her son. But on this particular day, she didn't turn up.
Joe got a phone call from one of his son's creches to say that their son hadn't been collected, which would have been very unusual. That would almost never have happened. He began ringing Rachel, and she didn't answer the phone. He rang her mother.
And he said he was just wondering, had we heard from Rachel that he hadn't? I said, God, that's very odd, I said, because if there was any problem at all, she definitely would have rang me. And I said, I'll go out now.
As Rachel's mother drove to the family home, Joe collected the boys and frantically called Rachel as he too headed there.
Rach, this is Joe. I tried your number now, I don't know how many times. You're not Jackie's, you're not your mother's. I'm now really, really, really worried about you. Please call me, please call. It isn't funny. This isn't like you.
When I came to her gate, when I went to drive in, I noticed her car was there, and I said, well, thank God she's here. The 2 dogs were out. I thought that was very strange because they never would have been outside if Rachel was in. The door was wide open, it was just right back. And I walked into the kitchen and the drawers of the unit had been emptied out onto the floor. And I started to get a bit uneasy.
Rose then made her way to Rachel's bedroom.
And the minute I looked at her, before I touched her, I knew she was dead. And I suppose I thought somebody must have broke in or something. Like, nothing was making sense to me. I knelt down beside her. Her arm felt like marble. It felt as if Rachel and I are the only two people on the planet. I couldn't even hear a bird, I don't think, at that stage.
Rose rang 999. But she was so distraught that the information which reached the Garda was of a burglary in progress. DI Pat Murray, who would become the senior investigating officer on the case, grabbed his car keys and set off.
You get out there as quick as you can. You always have the mindset, I might come across them, we might catch them. And as I was making my way out in the car, there were sort of conflicting messages coming through on the radio to say, oh, that lady is badly hurt. It could be a burglary gone wrong.
As Rachel's husband, Joe, pulled into the drive, he came face to face with her horrified mother.
He went to bring the two kids at the gate, but I was saying to myself, he can't. I had to let him know. And I whispered to him, Joe, you know, I think Rachel has been murdered. He ran up the driveway and with his hands to his head like that and ran in and down into the bedroom. And I running after him. He put his two hands back up to his head and said, Jesus, Rachel, what did you do? And I remember thinking to myself, what does he mean? What did Rachel do? Like, Rachel is murdered. Like, what does he mean?
It wouldn't be long before the police also arrived. But nothing could prepare them for the sheer horror of what they would find inside.
I never saw anything like it, and I've seen many's a body that scenes, but this was, you know, savage.
In 2004, there were 29 murders in Ireland. The murder rate had been falling, and violent crime in this part of North County Dublin was almost unheard of. Shortly after 2 p.m, Pat Murray arrived to take charge of the investigation into Rachel O'Reilly's death.
I said to the other guards, take out your notebook, take a note of every car here on the road, take a note of everyone that calls or passes or looks, and what they wear, if you get names, addresses, whatever, just take us down as much detail as possible. My superintendent was there. He said, there's a lady dead in there, and I want you to go in there and tell me what you see. I saw the drawers in the kitchen pulled open. The kitchen table was turned over. The blinds were drawn. I looked to my left, and there was a room there with a cabinet with those old cassette tapes scattered around the ground. Any burglar worth his salt breaks into a house. He makes his way to the bedroom, looks for jewellery, and he's gone. They don't bother with opening presses in kitchens or overturning tables. No, absolutely not. No. I can tell you this was no burglary.
Gardaí carrying out a preliminary investigation outside the house where the remains of a mother of two were found this afternoon. State pathologist Dr. Mary Cassidy was called to the scene after the discovery.
As soon as we get the call, it's literally coat on and out the door. Until I get to the body, I don't know what's going to be relevant. Then once they get to the body, everybody pulls back, you know, and you think, well, this is where I go forward.
I made my way down to the right, down a corridor, and down at the very end, at the very last room on the left, the body of a lady who I now know was Rachel O'Reilly lying on the ground. She was beaten to a pulp.
There was a lot of blood around her. When I took a closer look, I could see that she had splits in her scalp, so she had had severe injuries.
There was blood splattering on the wall, on the ceiling. There was blood on top of blood, which suggests that the blood had little time to dry, and then with a further assault, more blood was on top of that again. I never saw anything like it, and I've seen many's a body and many's a lady, you know, who died at scenes, but this was, you know, savage.
There's nothing specific enough about the injuries to identify an actual weapon. All I could say was it was something fairly heavy to cause the damage to the skull. Certainly something like a dumbbell, anything that is heavy enough and wielded with enough force. The force that they have to use to produce those injuries is pretty enormous.
I made my way outside. The superintendent said to me, "What did you see in there?" I said, "I saw two things." And he said, "What?" I said, "Firstly, it wasn't a burglary." "Correct," he said. And he says, "What's the second thing?" Well, I said, "Whoever done this to this lady hated her." I said, "There's a hate and a viciousness in what I seen down there." He says, "Correct. You might go out to the road there and talk to the husband," he said. And I saw, he was a big figure of a man. I shook his hand and I said who I was. And I said I would be investigating this and we'd get to the bottom of it. I told him not to speak to the media. And I said, we have to do a job and leave it to us to deal with the media, not to talk to them.
In the weeks that followed, Pat would soon learn more about Joe Riley.
He grew up in the north side of Dublin. He's one of 4 children, solidly working class.
I remember when I met him first, I thought he was sound.
There was nothing stand out, I have to be honest. He was aloof at best. We just thought he was shy. That's just his personality is what I would have thought. The first I would have known of him, he was working in a factory. It wasn't a career, it was a job. He didn't seem to have great drive in him. Rachel would encourage him to move up the ranks, and you know, he seemed to respond to that and he improved his jobs, and between them they seemed to work very well.
On the evening of Rachel's murder, Pat went to see Joe.
We wanted to talk to Joe, pure and simple, to find out about Rachel and her life and what life was she living that may have led to someone killing her. I said, had she any enemies? And he said, no, she had no enemies whatsoever. So I asked Joe then, is there anyone that could have done this? He said, people that he sacked, people he had run-ins with at work, and named them out. And I said, was she having an affair? No, neither of us were having an affair, he said. In the blink of an eye, I thought to myself, like, why would he bring himself into this answer, like, or into this question when I only asked about Rachel? So I asked him to account for his movements that day. He said he went to a gym and he met his friend and work colleague, Derek Querney, and then he made his way to work and was in there at 7:30 a.m. approximately.
He worked for an outdoor advertising company, which did a lot of advertising on the sides of buses, big kind of billboards in town.
He had to go and inspect one of the workers and some work in Broadstone that morning.
Broadstone bus depot was around 5 miles to the east of Joe's office.
I said, and did you meet him when you were in? No, I didn't meet him. I said, why not? Well, he said, I couldn't find him. And I said, well, who saw you there in Broadstone? And he said, Derek Querney did. I said, so there's no one else saw you in Broadstone, only Derek Querney? He said, yeah. So I said, that's fine.
Pat would check his alibi later, but before he left, he asked Joe one last question.
I said, Joe, did you ever have an affair? Did you have an affair? And he says, no, but I could see a little reading him like a little degree of hesitancy. So I looked at him straight in the eye, and I was forceful in my, let's say, intent in getting an answer by looking at him straight, and I said, Joe, did you have an affair? And he hesitated. He says, yeah, I had an affair. He says, but it's all over now, he said. He said, I don't want my family to know. I said, who did you have the affair with? Oh, someone at work, a girl called Nikki Pelly. I said, oh, all right. He says, myself and Rachel had a rocky relationship. It was rocky at times, but it's all great now, he said, you know.
Gardaí spent the day combing nearby undergrowth for evidence and carrying out house-to-house inquiries. Rachel O'Reilly was last seen at 9:30 yesterday morning after she dropped her 2-year-old son Adam off at this creche. Her last hours remain a mystery.
The day after Rachel was murdered, the investigation team is in full swing. The incident room is in full flow. We had all the stops out. We had to do questionnaires at checkpoints. We had to do questionnaires in respect of the locality in every house and person living in the area. And each questionnaire has to be analysed to see if there's anomalies in it or if another job is generated from it. And everyone was focused on bringing the killer to justice.
While Rachel O'Reilly's body was being taken to the city morgue, forensic experts remained inside her home looking for evidence that would lead them to a killer.
The Technical Bureau had spent several days in the house going through everything, taking fingerprints and fibre lifts and all that type of stuff from every room.
At that stage in an investigation, nobody knows what's going to be important. So we have to make sure that nothing is overlooked and nothing is dismissed.
However, they didn't find a murder weapon. So in the days that followed, the Garda broadened the search to the surrounding area.
And in the course of that search up the road from Joe's house, there was a bit of a culvert and there was a jewellery box and a camcorder found. It looked as if they'd just been left there. It wasn't in any way hidden.
When they showed the items to the family, they confirmed they'd belonged to Rachel. Pat's suspicions that this was murder dressed up as a burglary simply grew.
And a burglar doesn't come along, get stuff and hide it in the dish, you know. He puts it in and he gets transport and away he goes, like, you know. That's the way it is. It was a staged burglary, pure and simple. And a botched effort at that, like, you know.
The family home was now a crime scene. Joe moved into his mother's with his 2 young sons. Left behind, the friends and neighbours in the knoll were devastated.
Anger over the mother of 2's untimely death is evident in this small community. This message to her read, "May the person who took you from us never rest in peace."
Rachel had become an integral member of the community before she died. She had a lot of friends nearby. They would help each other out by kind of sharing the school runs with their kids. So she got to know a lot of the other young mums in the area.
Seven days after she was killed, her friends and family all came together to say their final goodbyes.
Like, I've never seen a crowd like it. It was packed. It was a big church. There was just people everywhere. You wouldn't think one person could know that many people, to be honest. Her spirit had touched a lot of people, you know, throughout her life. It was incredible, really.
Her funeral was held in the same church where she and Joe had married 10 years previously.
I'm not sure where Joe sat in the church, but I do clearly remember him up in the pulpit. You'd think he was at a wedding giving a speech. And I just felt to myself, he's so blasé and cracking little jokes. "Rachel forgives you," he said. And I remember getting so angry at that. I thought to myself, how would you know that Rachel forgives whoever murdered her?
Rachel's body may have been laid to rest, but the media frenzy surrounding her murder simply exploded.
It literally is straight out of a sort of a thriller.
The viciousness and savagery of that crime is absolutely astounding.
Any reporter, any crime reporter in Dublin is really, every time anybody talks to them in any pub or anything like that, they're absolutely assailed by people demanding to know what the latest is on the Rachel O'Reilly case.
Young mum of two found dead in her home, bludgeoned to death. Thankfully, it's rare. And also, I think just the fact that her children were so young, it immediately struck a chord with people.
Everyone wanted to know more about the beautiful and tragic young mother, Rachel.
There's 5 of us, 5 kids, all adopted. Grew up just a normal semi-D Dublin. Dad's a plumber, worked hard, Mam reared us. We were very close, as the two of us, because we would have been the closest in age. She was mad into sports, dance. She would have been very, very competitive. Not in the extreme of having to win, but she'd have to take part. That was the big thing.
Rachel was still in her teens when she first met her husband, working part-time at a local store.
He told me that she had stuck out because she was so tall.
She must have been 5'11"-ish. She was a strong girl, just physically strong, but very soft, like she'd never hurt you or anything.
She fell for him hook, line and sinker. She had a beautiful wedding. I remember when she got her dress.
Oh, it was fabulous. She wasn't really into fashion, but when she dressed up, she looked brilliant.
They had a lovely house, 2 lovely kids. He had a good job. They seemed to have it all, to be honest.
Oh, that is gorgeous. Here's Rachel, the hairdresser. Hello. Let's go.
But as the story of Rachel's murder permeated every corner of Ireland, new investigative leads started to come through that left her good character in doubt.
We got an anonymous contact that Rachel was abusing the children and that Rachel had been reported to the social services.
Young mother of 2, Rachel O'Reilly, was dead, brutally murdered in her own home. Her family and the nation were in shock. How could this have happened in such a small, peaceful corner of North County Dublin? Then the police got a tip-off that cast doubt on Rachel's character.
We got an anonymous contact that Rachel was abusing the children and that Rachel had been reported to the social services.
When the police investigated, they discovered no further action had been taken, and not one of her friends or family seemed to think Rachel was anything but the perfect mother.
She was a great mother. She was someone who wanted the best life possible for her and her family.
Like the second lad, he was just glued to her. You know, anywhere she went, he was on the hip. You know, you carrying him around.
So who had it in for Rachel? Meantime, Joe couldn't possibly be a suspect. After all, he had his alibi, his workmate, which at the time made him untouchable. So along with Rose and Jim, Rachel's parents, he agreed to appear on RTE's News at 1.
I would appeal to anybody that knows anything at all that they might even think unimportant, if they could rack their brains.
What we can gather was that has been taken so far doesn't just, not that anything can justify that what happened, but it just doesn't justify the violence and the excess of what happened. It just doesn't fit. Why kill her? You know, we feel because she could identify that person. So it's quite possible that this is someone she knew, this is someone we knew. Somebody somewhere has to have seen something.
Although police had yet to identify a suspect, the forensic analysis of the crime scene was now complete. And a few weeks after Rachel's brutal murder, husband Joe moved back into the family home.
When we give the house back, we like to have it cleansed. The scene was still very bloody down at where Rachel was killed. A lot of blood on the ceiling and on the walls. And Joe looked around and he looked at the blood and he says, no, leave it. I'll get the lads in and we look after it.
But before the clean-up, Joe made a bizarre invitation to Rachel's family to revisit the home and untouched scene of the crime.
And he said to me, I found a great sense of peace. He said, it would do you good. I said, I didn't want to go down to the house. I swore I'd never go into that house again. And Jim kept saying, well, you heard Joe. He said he felt a great sense of peace.
And brought us all into the kitchen and he played the answering machine in the house. And we listened.
Hiya, Rach. It's only me. I just got a call from Helen in Montessori. She says you haven't picked up Adam. Was Sarah meant to pick him up or something? Give us a shout, will you?
I remember we were standing and I was saying to myself, what in God's name is he playing that back for?
Rach, this is Joe. I tried your number now, I don't know how many times. You're not in Jackie's, you're not in your mother's. I'm now really, really, really worried about you. Please call me, please call. It isn't funny. This isn't like you.
He was playing this real loud, you know, and it was like a house of horrors. And listen to this as well.
Rach, it's me again. Please ring. I've been crying. You have me worried. I don't know. Please talk to me, please.
There was 3 or 4 or 5 calls from him at certain times during the day of the 4th, appealing for Rach to ring him back, and he was sounding real concerned and stuff, and it didn't sound real.
Joe's bizarre behaviour reached another level altogether when he invited journalist Jenny Friel to the house.
He brought us straight into the kitchen, which was still kind of in a state of disarray, and he apologised for all of that. He suddenly asked us if we would like to see where it happened. Now, I was still at the beginning of my career. I wasn't sure, you know, what he was offering or asking us. I kind of, I suppose I stalled a little and kind of said, you know, bring us down to the bedroom? And he went, yeah, I can bring you down to the bedroom, show you where it happened. He talked us through the blood splatters on the wall, on the skirting board. He pointed them all out for us just in case we missed any of them. He raised his arm up with whatever, you know, the weapon had been in his hand, and he brought it down several times to explain how Rachel had been, how he believed that Rachel had been probably lying on the ground after the initial attack, and the killer had continued to hit her over the head. It was one of the strangest, most unsettling things I've ever been talked through.
Rachel's family were also taken on a similar tour of the house, and it led Rose to only one conclusion.
As he was talking, Rachel was now in my head, and she kept on at me. I wasn't even thinking of, she kept saying, Mama, it was him. And we got into the car, like we were still, Jim and I, in deep, deep shock. I said to Jim, hey, Jim, I think Joe murdered our Rachel.
The calls from journalist to Joe continued. 4 days after their RTE appearance, with still no sign of a murder suspect, Joe and Rose were invited onto The Late Show, Ireland's longest-running and most popular TV show.
We were brought up to the green room first, with tea and sandwiches and coffee and drinks and all that. Well, the girls said to us after, they never saw a fellow wolfing down sandwiches. You think they were going out of fashion. He had all rings around him. There wasn't a bother on him.
For a man who's supposed to be grieving, he was far from grieving. He was talking on his phone all the time and walking around.
Rose and Joe sat side by side as Rachel's sister, Anne, paid a tribute to her.
She was just such an amazing person, a natural nurturer, a fantastic sister.
a super wife, a fantastic daughter, everything. And our family is just devastated that there's just such a void that will never be filled.
It was hard not to notice the tension between the two guests.
Rose just stared out into the audience. It was noticeable that she just didn't acknowledge him. When it came to Joe speaking, her face just kind of seemed to go into almost like a mask-like state.
Based on the situation you both found in the house, I mean, did you get the sense that she'd been taken unawares, that this was someone that perhaps she trusted?
Yeah, I think so. Where the murder happened was in the bedroom, which is the very last room of the house. So it's the room where you're least likely to bring someone you don't know because you're cornered. My view as well would be, and again, it's just my view, it's not a police theory, it's just my own personal belief, is that she knew the person, because why else would you kill her? If it's a violent robbery, why go to the extreme of murdering the person unless they can identify him? And that's why we've talked about this and practically nothing else for the last 3 weeks. We just feel it's someone she would have known or someone she could have identified.
She couldn't sit far enough away from Joe, even though she was sitting beside him. And, you know, his plea was really very non-convincing, and I think a lot of people are of the opinion that he has put himself in as a suspect from the way he carried on.
It was what everyone was talking about at work the following Monday. Did you see Rose Callally? Did you see the way she was not looking at Joe O'Reilly? Did you see how angry she looked? And it was extraordinary television. It's kind of got almost mythical status now at this stage. Like, everyone kind of talks about where they were when that interview was on TV.
The police had strongly advised Joe to avoid the media. Yet only 3 days after his revealing interview on The Late Late Show, every media outlet in the country was clamouring for an interview with Joe. And he agreed to appear on a high-profile radio show.
Joe, thank you very much for talking to us on The Right Hook here this evening.
Thanks, Chair.
We were the bank holiday crew, so my day job was not presenting that show on a day-to-day basis. We had a researcher, and she'd been freelancing that week in Ireland on Sunday. He was on the front page of the paper. We came in the next day and said, should we try and get him on if he's talking? She went and got the number, sourced him. The producer called him, but assumed he wouldn't do it. I think I was as surprised as anybody to hear that, yeah, so Joe O'Reilly's going to do it. He's up after the break. The Gardaí have said that this is an incredibly strange case. The fact that an attempt was made to pretend that it was a burglary. Have they explained why they think it's so strange?
No, actually, that's probably somebody quoting my theory. I haven't heard any of the guards said to me. So when the guards asked me, did I see anything strange? Did I notice anything strange? To me, the house at first glance looked like it was burgled, but as I went through the house again, bit by bit, there wasn't an awful lot of damage. There wasn't an awful lot taken. So unless you walked in on the very, very early stages of a burglary, it's unlikely.
He never once referenced his wife or her life or who she was or anything to do with what made her human. Like, she doesn't exist in that context in that interview. One of the other things that's emerged over the last couple of days is that 2 towels were taken. Now, one of the newspapers today has made the leap that they think that it's possible the murderer had a shower in your house. Is that something the Gardaí have said, or...?
It's not something the Gardaí have said, but the fact that the towel's missing, that's true. I suspect that if the person did have a shower, then they've left some of their hair, their DNA, that, you know, something will be found in the bathtub or in the traps underneath the bathtub for the drainage and so on.
Even when he's talking about, this isn't the police theory, this is my theory, and it's like, well, are you a detective? Why are you going around trying to solve this murder in this way? And has that been difficult for you?
Having to relive the day all the time too is quite difficult. I mean, it's not like a normal death where, you know, it happens and you talk about it and you move on, and this is every single day having to regurgitate different details, and there's just no closure, Jer.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a drag, essentially, was the answer. Like, this is not somebody talking about discovering the most horrific scene that they're ever going to see in their entire lives. Like, I definitely remember having spoken to him and being utterly convinced after that we'd spoken to a murderer on the show that day.
All over Ireland, people's perceptions of Joe were beginning to change. He was no longer seen as the grieving widower, but something else entirely.
I think the tide turned, is the simplest way of putting it. And there were more salacious headlines, more suggestive news pieces being used, casting doubt on his story.
We're plumbers, myself, my dad and my brother, and we were in a lot of houses doing jobs.
I was working in a house up in Fisborough. There was a burst or something, and the woman made a cup of tea for me, and she said to me, "Did you see the late the other night?" And I said I did. She said, "Do you know who the murderer is?" And I said, "Well, I don't really, I couldn't say for sure." She said, "Your man Joe O'Reilly is the murderer."
There was something about Joe's story that didn't add up. Police had heard from several sources that the affair he'd said was over was anything but.
Our next port of call was to Nikki Pelly, and she confirmed that they had a relationship, you know, that they were in a relationship, but she played down the relationship and didn't divulge to us the extent of our relationship.
But the police persisted with their investigations, and they discovered that after the Late Late Show, he'd spent the night with his lover.
RT were offering a night in a hotel, like, you know, as an overnight stay. He said he couldn't avail of it and that he had clients to look after. And he went off and he met Nikki Pelly and spent the night with her. Here's a guy who's supposed to be on the TV pleading for information about his wife, and then he's gone off with his lover, like, you know, so it's sort of, you know, bad taste, bad.
As Joe rapidly became the police's prime suspect, new phone evidence would soon emerge that condemned him even more.
What went on in those conversations, and why did Joe not tell us about these phone calls?
Joe O'Reilly was now the prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Rachel, but the police had no evidence against him. Then they got a lucky break. Joe's phone records for the day that Rachel was murdered. And there were numerous calls to his mistress, Nikki Pelly.
The phone record showed quite clearly at 5:45 a.m. Nikki had rang Joe and spoke to him for 20 minutes. And then at 7:13 a.m. he had rang her back and spoke for 4 minutes. And then at around 8 o'clock, Nikki rang him again and they spoke for another 20 minutes. So these are fairly lengthy conversations. What went on in those conversations? And why did Joe not tell us about these phone calls?
In total, there were 18 calls and texts between Nikki and Joe on the day of Rachel's murder. The first at 5:45 a.m. and the last at 6:56 p.m.
Joe's story, there was a lot of inconsistencies. First he told us that he was the affair, he wasn't having an affair. So that was his first lie.
And Pat wondered what else he could be lying about. Joe had said he was at Broadstone bus depot with a colleague, Derek Querney, the morning Rachel was murdered.
So as part of the strategy to find out who is telling the truth, we asked Joe and Derek to walk the paths that they walked in Broadstone that morning.
Derek Querney went first.
And Derek Querney pointed out, yeah, I was here, I visited there, I went into the canteen here, went into an office here, I was out, I saw Joe here, this, that and the other, and that was it. Then we got Joe to walk us through his footsteps that morning. his story couldn't be more opposite. So it showed us definitively that Derek Kearney couldn't have seen Joe, and Joe couldn't have seen Derek Kearney, because the stories didn't match up. They were totally different.
With Derek Kearney saying he could not be sure of timings, and Joe's alibi shattered, further forensic evidence then emerged that fueled the case against Joe, on a pair of boots Pat had taken from him at the murder scene.
Our forensic people said, yes, there's blood on the inside of the right foot between the sole and the laces. That blood we could establish was Rachel's. How could he have got these blood drops, we asked. And they said they were drops that came from a distance down. So I said, this is great now, because when else could he have got those drops other than at the time he was killing his wife?
Pat immediately contacted Rachel's two friends and her mother Rose, who were at the crime scene when Joe arrived that morning.
And I asked them to describe what Joe did, and they all said he got down on his knees and he put his feet together. So what's the likelihood of him getting spots of blood on the inside of his shoe? If he had been kneeling down with his feet together, I would say quite slim. We believed he was a suspect at that stage. Once he moves into a suspect bracket, it's very defining, because you can arrest someone then who's a suspect to question him on the suspicion of the murder.
Shortly after 10:10, Rachel O'Reilly's husband Joe was arrested at the family home in Dunall, and he was taken in for questioning in relation to his wife's murder.
Joe refused to answer most of their questions. And the forensic evidence fell through because the blood on his boot could have landed there when he moved a box at the scene. The police were forced to abandon their questioning.
A man in his 30s arrested yesterday and questioned at Drogheda Garda station for 12 hours, walked free last night. He made no comments to waiting members of the media.
I was a little bit disappointed, but that's it, that's life, and you have to take what the forensic people tell you. They're experts and they know best, and that's it.
The police remained convinced Joe was their man. But 5 months since Rachel's murder, the police seemed no closer to nailing her killer. So Pat headed over to Rachel's family to talk through events once more.
We were down chatting and sitting down and having a cup of tea, and you talk about everything else, the weather and bits and pieces, like, and, you know, she said, I can't believe he done that. I wonder what he wrote in that letter. And we were saying, what letter? Oh, she says, we're here before they put the lid on Rachel's coffin. We were all writing notes to put in the coffin, and Joe was sitting there, and they gave him a pen and a paper and an envelope, and he wrote something on it and put it into the coffin. So my mum, myself and Peter McCoy looked at each other, and we were both thinking exactly the same thing. What in God's name is written in that letter? There was no doubt in any of our minds we'd have to look to have the coffin exhumed to recover this letter, to see what was actually in it.
Could this letter be a confession? The very evidence the police needed to prove Joe was the killer, responsible for the brutal murder of his wife and mother to his 2 boys, Rachel O'Reilly.